Hey everyone, and welcome to today's presentation. We're going to continue talking about thinking and deciding, but in this one, focus on biases in thinking and deciding. And we alluded to some of these things in the thinking and deciding video, but we're going to focus more on specific ones that a lot of us employ on a daily basis. So in the thinking and deciding video, we talked about normative versus descriptive models. And normative models sort of describe the rules of quote unquote correct thinking. But this doesn't necessarily mean that we think that way. We don't necessarily think in rational ways all the time. We most likely use descriptive models. And this is because we used biased and shortened thinking or use shortcuts to our thinking through heuristics. And so descriptive models, models that attempt to explain human thinking and decision making as they really are, even when we deviate from normative rules. One of the ways in which our thinking is most biased often comes through the evidence and existence of heuristics. And these are mental shortcuts that we use, mental strategies that we use to involve simpler decision-making processes in order to save cognitive energy. And so we can use less cognitive effort by using these simple strategies and sort of making these probability judgments. But what often happens is that we lead ourselves to less logical information being used. And so there's often a greater number of important aspects to consider. And so if we are to make more effective decisions, then we need to make sure that we are using a mix of heuristics. We need to make sure that we are using multiple at the same time. So a few different heuristic strategies. Lexicographic strategy, where you select the option with the best value on what is perceived as most important. Satisficing strategy for decisions, each option being considered in terms of whether all perceived important aspects meet a certain minimum level. If they fail to reach that level, the option is rejected. Majority of confirming decisions. So this is where options are considered in pairs on all important aspects, with the winning option being retained and then compared against the winning option of another pair. So you sort of like create a tournament for yourself of what the best option would be, where you are eliminating certain choices if they don't sort of beat out the other option they're being compared against. And then elimination by aspects. So this involves rejecting options that do not meet a minimum level on the most important aspect. And so this is repeated for the second one, the third one, so on and so forth. And so this combines both aspects of the LEX and the SSD in order to make a decision here. So the first study we're going to look at today is LUCE, BETTMAN, and PAYNE from 1997. And the aim of this was that researchers predicted that if decision making really adapts to emotion, people who make choices involving emotionally difficult trade-offs will often process information more extensively, and then will also choose strategies that allow them to avoid emotionally difficult trade-offs. And this was an experiment and independent measures design involving 27 different undergrad students. So in this, they all assumed the role of members of a charity and were required to decide which of 5 imaginary children would receive financial support. Each of the 5 kids were described in terms of 5 attributes: living conditions, family size, social class, those sorts of things. All attributes were relevant to the decision maker. And then participants were then split into 2 groups that they did. So the first one was a higher emotion group, in which participants were told that the other 4 children were not likely to receive help from anyone else. The lower emotion group, though, is where the participants were told that the 4 remaining children were likely to receive some sort of help elsewhere at a later time. And then they sort of measured the activities of the subjects by using this program called MouseLab, and that sort of tracked which screens they looked at, how long they looked at each screen, that sort of stuff. And this is under the assumption that, if you look at a screen longer, you're sort of taking more of the information in, you're more carefully considering it, those sorts of things. So the results, the participants in the higher emotion group, where they were told that the children were not going to receive money from any other location or source if they did not win the scholarship, those people spent more time on the task. They opened a larger number of cells in total, and this showed that they considered the decision more carefully. They also engaged more frequently in attribute-based transitions. This involved less emotionally difficult trade-offs and showed that they experienced more negative emotion in the process of making the decision. And so they, not only did they think about it more, but they also tried to alleviate themselves of some of the guilt over giving it to a child who would not receive aid elsewhere, even though this was a completely imaginary situation or abstract situation. So the conclusion was that this sort of went back to the adaptive decision maker framework, and this confirmed a lot of those. But it may also be concluded that emotional variables need to be incorporated directly into a model of decision making. And oftentimes our cognition can sometimes be changed by the decision making processes we go through, like heuristics. All right, so in terms of different types of thinking, intuitive thinking is one in which we've identified numerous cognitive biases. And these are often loosely grouped based on the factors that may cause them. So there's 3 major factors. The first one are tendency to focus on a limited portion of available information, or the framing effect, as we'll see. The second one, tendency to seek out information that confirms pre-existing beliefs, like confirmation bias and illusory correlation. And then the tendency to avoid the mental stress of holding inconsistent cognitions, or cognitive dissonance. So the first of these effects is framing. So this is an example of cognitive bias in which people react to a particular choice in different ways depending on how it is presented. So either it's presented as a loss or it's presented as a gain. And there's 2 details that go along with this. The first is that people tend to avoid risk when a positive frame is presented, but seek risks when a negative frame is presented. And that may seem counter to what you think would happen. But if you think about a class, or an even better example would be like a basketball game, for instance. Let's say you're down 20 with 5 minutes left. It's much more likely that you're going to start looking for more risky solutions that you wouldn't had you been up 20 points. If you're up 20, you sort of want to play conservatively. You don't want to be, shooting a bunch of long shots that may not make it. You're going to start slowing down the game, not playing as fast. Maybe you don't want to foul people, so you don't play as tight of defense as you would have before. But if you're down 20, you're almost in a position where it's like, what do we have to lose? And so you end up taking more risks because of that. And so gains and losses are often defined in framing as descriptions of outcomes. So lives lost or saved, disease patients treated and not treated, lives saved and lost during accidents, stuff like that. The next type is loss aversion. And this refers to people's tendency to prefer avoiding losses to acquiring equivalent gains. So they're more likely not to take risks in that way. And this can lead to a cognitive bias because maybe the risk was not that great, but because you were playing it so sort of tight to the vest and trying not to lose money, then trying to find money and trying to make money, then maybe there's a there's a loss there. And then we have the use of information and bias. And oftentimes, the ways in which we use information can be biased in a couple ways. The first is that information is easily available and may be paid more attention to. Information which is easily memorable is seen as more important, so those that are more emotional or have more of a personal connection. But again, this may include a lot of biases. You know, think about that in terms of thinking and deciding. Emotional decisions, personal connection decisions, probably not the best. You don't always want to hire, if you're making a choice on who to hire for a business, you may not want to make the choice based on some emotional story they told you. You may not want to make that decision based on the fact that they're your best friend. You want to make that decision rationally to, you know, help your company the most. And then it also, information that displays an individual in a positive way will be favored. We often have a self-serving bias, and we oftentimes make choices when we are voting for someone based on that self-serving bias. Oftentimes people will vote on their checkbooks, regardless of whether that is going to be best for the society or not, or even best in the long run for them. So the next type of bias we're going to talk about is confirmation bias. And this is another possible cause of intuitive thinking. We have a tendency to seek out information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs and ignore information that contradicts our beliefs. And we've seen this before and have talked about this before in terms of not only processing information, but also in terms of just an example from today's society. Oftentimes we'll read from sources that we agree with and disregard those that we don't agree with, regardless of whether that source is correct or not. And so this often violates the rules of logic. It's an irrational line of thinking because we're avoiding one other part of the answer. But it is common for human thinking. The next one, illusory correlation. This is a cognitive bias leading people to see a connection between things or events that are not actually connected. We have a tendency to seek out information that confirms one's belief or can also be seen in illusory correlation. And if you think about a Rorschach inkblot test, which I'm going to show in a second here, you know, this is the underlying theory behind that, because psychologists are looking for you to make connections between this picture and something going on in your life, which may reveal something about what you're thinking. It also can be the mechanism of stereotype formation, where we are making generalizations based on things that may not be connected. And oftentimes the normative model of statistics is violated in this particular case. So stereotypes and illusory correlations, again, oftentimes illusory correlation does form the basis for many other phenomena like stereotypes. So that's a big application of it. So in that, we're going to look at ALLPORT and POSTMAN again. So again, the aim of this, how does schema theory impact our memory and recall? Participants were shown a picture of two men fighting of different races. The white man in the picture had a knife. In the results, participants oftentimes recalled that the black person was the one with the knife. And so the conclusion was that the schema theory impacts memory, and then also that, you know, it changes our thinking and decision-making power. It creates bias within those. So here's a Rorschach inkblot test. Just try and see what you are going to, what you see in the picture. I'll give a few seconds here. So based on your answers, whether you saw a stormtrooper from Star Wars helmet, or whether you saw a man with a mustache, or you saw a butterfly in the middle, right? These can all point to different connections you are making between this, you know, abstract or ambiguous picture and your own life. There's a few other cognitive biases. The first one is cognitive dissonance, a so-called motivational bias that focuses on personal motivation for selection and interpretation of information so that your cognitions are consistent with your decisions and or your behavior, right? So the consistency between your values, between your thoughts, between what you've been taught and your behaviors here. We can often see this when, you know, people may think one thing, have been raised in a certain culture, and are practicing something completely different in their own lives. There's also a bias called optimism bias, the tendency to think that nothing bad will ever happen to you. Obviously, this couldn't be the case. At some point, bad things will happen to all of us. And it makes you more risky in your choices potentially because you think, no, oh, nothing bad would ever happen. And then we have selective attention, the tendency to focus on a limited amount of stimuli when several are occurring at the same time. And so we eliminate information that might be really helpful to your decision. Now, in terms of how we judge information, how we evaluate information, there's a few biases that are a part of this, and most of it is due to the fact that we have a sheer amount of sensory information around us, too much for us to take all of it in, leading to selective attention like we just talked about. And so this oftentimes leads to bias for two reasons. One, we like to be confident in our judgments, and this leads to us to not paying attention to potential sources of uncertainty, maybe things that we've never seen before or are foreign to us. Number two is an insufficient anchoring judgment, and this involves not updating our decisions as new information becomes available. You know, sadly, I think we do this way too often. You know, we get more and more information and we almost stick to our guns by saying, like, by denying this new information that's come out instead of, you know, reevaluating and coming to a new logical conclusion. And so once a judgment is made, it acts as a mental anchor. And we sort of are anchored in that position instead of a lot more logically thinking and, you know, and ignoring information that is inconsistent with the original judgment. So that leads us into a study called Rosenthal and Jacobson. And this is from 1968. And the idea here was that people who hold a stereotype may influence the behavior of the stereotype group. And so the aim for this study was to investigate whether students of whom greater intellectual growth is expected will actually show greater intellectual growth in a period of 1 year or less. And oftentimes the way in which we talk about this one is in terms of the role of the teacher in, you know, giving or allowing the child to have this intellectual growth. So the participants, 320 students from the same public school, grades 1 to 6, 255 were in the control group, 65 in the experimental group. And the procedure was that teachers in the school were told that certain students were expected to grow in intellectual ability on the basis of an IQ test. And the test was fictitious in reality, and students were chosen at random. So in the year of the experiment, control group students who were not told anything about their intellectual abilities, or the teacher was not told anything about their intellectual abilities, gained 8.4 IQ points, while the experimental group, which was told that they were expected to grow quite a bit, regardless of whether that child was actually extremely gifted or not, gained 12.2 IQ points. And so many of the youngest students showed the greatest disparity. For instance, you know, first grade, 27.4 IQ point gains compared to just 12 in the control group. And so oftentimes what we can conclude is that how we expect people to perform can change our thinking about that person and can also change the ways in which we work with that person. And so our initial anchoring heuristic can influence the beliefs we have about a person. Even if the child struggled early on, I'm sure that the teacher seemed to stick with that anchoring heuristic that this child is supposed to succeed, and so maybe it's my fault they're not. The stereotypes we have about other people may also affect their behavior through the process of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the more that the teacher was more positive with that student about their growth, the more that the child grew. And so there's a few things in terms of confidence, self-efficacy that may also be tied to this, but you can see there that there's a clear thinking and decision-making bias from the teacher and potentially from the student as well. Now, in terms of our post-decision evaluation, we oftentimes want to maintain our self-esteem or self-value. So we do not pay attention to information that may show us in a negative way. And so this may lead to a fundamental attribution bias. We tend to see favorable outcomes as being a result of actions under our control. I'm smart, I'm gifted, I'm talented, and unfavorable outcomes as due to factors not under our control. It's their fault. This happened and this is why that didn't happen. So in essence, really it's a message of if it's good, it's me. If it's bad, it's you. And it protects our self-esteem, even though, at some point we have to take a personal, acceptance of what has happened. We also like to feel in control. So we give ourselves more power over a situation than we should. And we underestimate how poor our decisions might be. Prevents us from learning from experience. There's also another bias called hindsight bias. This is where you see an event as having been predictable, even though there was no information for predicting its occurrence. Like I knew it all along. So an accident occurs and you're in the car accident and you said, I knew that was going to happen, even though there's nothing that possibly could have told you that was going to happen. And so when we're looking at thinking and decision-making bias on the whole, there's a few things we need to take into account here. Studies of bias are often in artificial labs, and so it calls into question an issue of ecological validity. Would this happen in real life? And so more real-life scenarios like we saw in Rosenthal and Jacobson should be used. Also, people who hold paranormal beliefs often have an illusion of control, like picking winning lotto numbers or sports games, stuff like that. And this is often a confirmation bias when it turns out to be true. And then also studies in deception could be unethical, like the Rosenthal and Jacobson case. What if they had told the teachers that certain students were supposed to perform poorly? Where would that have gone? Because this may induce stress as well. With that being said, as always, if you have any questions, please contact me. Other than that, please have a great day.